Hello, Advanced Motion Design. In the previous class, we talked about finishing up a composite so that we can take away any shadows that we don't want at the edge of a countertop or table or wall. What if we were working with a real countertop or wall? We've created scenes within After Effects and Photoshop and now Deletion, but we, in the next couple of classes, are going to be working with Adobe Aero, which is an augmented reality program. That's going to allow us to take 3D models like this, or any of the 2.5D models that we've been working with. Not so much models, but just those layers along the Z, and bring them into Deletion so that we can place them in real space. And there are some examples of this in Blackboard. In the Week 14 folder, I have a PSD that you can download to play with Van Gogh's Starry Night. I've already cleaned it up in Photoshop and made it into multiple layers, which is something you're going to want to do in Photoshop or Illustrator with your own designs for your final when you figure out what you want to create. And then if you want to place and see the design, you can scan this QR code either on the screen or by going to the Week 14 folder and just going to this ping. And then if you have Aero on your phone, which is just a free app, you'll be able to place that Starry Night AR file on a flat horizontal surface somewhere in your house. Now, Adobe Aero is considered a beta app, and here I actually have that rocket fuel setup that we had created before. So there's quite a few ways that we can import assets within Aero. From Deletion, it's actually pretty simple. If we create our 3D models and we bring in our graphics and position them the way that we want them, once we're done there, we would just go File, Export, Selected for Aero, and that's going to put it into the Creative Cloud. And that's crucial for sharing work within Aero because that's how we're going to be able to access it. And so if I click Export, that's just going to let me give it a name, and then I'm going to be able to access that from within the Aero app also. So I had downloaded Aero from the Creative Cloud. So if you haven't downloaded Aero yet, there's the beta for the desktop and then the mobile version, which is more than likely what people are going to use. This is actually free for people to use just because that's kind of the consumer level version of it. So if I wanted to bring our Deletion model into here, I could file export it to there into the cloud. And then if I launched Aero, I can bring it into there by going File, Import, and then navigating to that cloud file. So if I wanted to export this, I could export this scene for Aero, and just give it a name. The Aero interface is pretty simple. It's not that complicated of a program. Similar to Deletion, it's more of a finishing tool. You're not really building the 3D in here, you're more preparing it for augmented reality and maybe adding triggers for animation as well. So here you could see that I have my Deletion model. And then if I wanted to export this so that somebody could place it and view it with their Aero app, then I could export it from Aero. So I have this workflow here, this life cycle, where this actually started in Illustrator. I mentioned this is pretty simple. We have just some tools along the side here. I could import if I didn't already have this file, so I could import this GLB export. That's what I had created from Dimension. I also could just select it, and then we've got our 3D handle here to rotate. You can see it's just all one object. We really can't edit in here other than rotate and scale. We can move. And then we have our orbit, pan, and dolly tools, which have the shortcut of 1, 2, and 3, which is extremely helpful. So I can get this into position, and this is really just for us to check out how it looks, because obviously the position, the camera angle, is really going to be the person, the consumer with the phone, with the app or tablet that's looking at this Aero file once it's exported. So we're really just getting a sense of how it looks. We could export this as a ping, but that's not really what Aero is for. Aero is really more for exporting this experience so that somebody else can experience it on their tablet. So if I want to edit this, I would edit the source material. Like now that I look at it from behind, I see that this bag is just kind of floating here. So if I go to the dimension file that this is based on and just kind of ignore this background. So I took the pings I want from this, I did the product mockup. I'm going to go to my background here and just turn that off. I've got those 1, 2, and 3 camera shortcuts, and I'm just going to rotate here, and I can see that's the case. I'm going to click on the food bag, click on V to go back to my rotation tool here. And I'm just going to reposition this bag, which I'm doing a horrible job of here, but you can see it highlights blue when it's touching the ground plane, which is very helpful. Don't want it to be floating, but we also don't want it to be going into the ground. And that looks a little bit more natural. I want it to be a little bit more along that middle axis, much at all. So dialing it in this way might actually be better. There we go. There we go. All right, so we have our updated rocket fuel mock-up here. And I'm just kind of looking over the placement of things. And I had a few different files open, which is something I should have checked prior to updating them. So I'm going to get rid of this previous one. We can have multiple layers in here. So if something wasn't part of this original composite, we could bring in different elements. They don't have to all be part of the same dimension file or anything like that. But you can make changes. So I want to be able to see the face of this bag better. So if I go to the file that this one's based on and rotate this, and I think the issue is that I'm saving this other file. I've got a lot of save as going on here, but if you save the file that something's based on, it would update that other thing, and I'm saving it as a separate file, but you know how saving files goes. I would have to export this again. So, anyways. Now, if I wanted to share this and have somebody be able to view it in their phone, I could also export this just to the cloud and view it on my phone. Now, obviously, I can't demonstrate that from right here, but there's a few different ways to do that from just Aero. So if I do file export, this is where I get the .real file. So that's an Aero experience file. And that's what I would save to Creative Cloud and what I could access from my phone app. Otherwise, I'd have a better idea of what this is going to look like if I click on the preview button versus edit. Though it doesn't exactly give me a great idea. It still has the grid and everything up there. I'm going to go back to edit here. On the far right corner, there is a share arrow. And here I can give it a new title, and then I would want to click Create Link. And this link is where I get this QR code. I get the QR code that I can create a ping from. That's what this little folder is for. And then I have the link itself. And so if I click on that little folder, I can generate that ping. I'm going to generate that to the desktop. And then if you go export, it will just take you to those same export options that you had over there. So this file had started in Illustrator where I'd first drawn that little rocket using the revolve tools. We had brought that into After Effects where we had played with those different planets. Those planets are also something that we could bring into here and play with in 2.5D. We could revolve half of that can to create that shape, though I believe this was an asset within Dimension. We have extruded text within here. This is mapped in Dimension, but then that is exported into Aero, where we can place it in a real scene. Now, you might not have this file, but you have your own. You have that Starry Night PSD, and you also have a whole lot of starter assets, just like you do within Dimension to get started. So let me just make a new file here. Untested. That does not sound like something that should be said out loud. And so if you look at the starter assets, you already know about Adobe Stock and that you can get a lot of different free assets from there. But something I would recommend doing as you brainstorm about what you want to do for your final, which is just going to be creating something 3D within augmented reality of your own design, whether it's 2.5D or 3D or a combination of both, is look through some of these starter assets and get a sense for just this interface, even though, like I said, the interface of Aero is really simple. It's even simpler than Dimension. These are really more finishing tools than anything else. This, you're really creating more of an experience that you see with a mobile device. That's why this is a beta app on a desktop. But abstract shapes, you have these different circles and things you can use. So if you click on an object, you can drag it out in here. And under scenes, it's almost like your layers palette. You've got your different objects you can click on. You can select to effect as with anything and move it along the grid here and rotate it. If you want to do something more by the numbers, you've got the properties down below. Anything with a lock icon next to it, whether it's a layer or a value, you can turn on or off. Same thing with an eyeball. Similar to Dimension, is you can snap to ground plane with this little icon here. You can also trash something. You can duplicate something. You can revert to original size. So we've got all these different random shapes that we can play with. I was impatient when double clicking there. So lots and lots of different random objects here. Like I said, 1, 2, 3 are going to give you your different camera tools. So you can do your staging within this desktop area, and then you would export the experience to share using this icon up here to either create a link to share with people or that QR code that you can use as well. And we'll be talking about some different options in the next class, including creating directable characters and creating triggers. Like if people tap, we can create triggers where somebody can touch an icon and reveal something else. They're still adding functionality like that, but it's exciting to see the possibilities grow. We also have different types of anchors, whether horizontal, vertical, or attached to a particular image. But there's a bunch of abstract shapes. There's some animation. Let me turn this one off. So some little animatable characters. Oops. And I don't know why I added a little kid with the balloon when there's a perfectly good dinosaur to add. So this is the kind of thing that you also would probably want to try just with your phone, because if you play with your phone, then you can immediately place the objects as well. With your phone and your phone's camera, you'll be able to scan the area for surfaces, kind of like when you're in After Effects and scanning an area for tracking. Depending on what kind of anchor you have selected, whether horizontal or vertical, it'll look for areas that are suitable for this model and then place it accordingly. So we've got some different animation models or some directable characters with different model types that you can choose from. Also different things that we can control there. Interior design. Layered illustrations. So with something like this, let me turn off the visibility for the dinosaur for a moment. This is more like the 2.5D kind of thing. So if we go down to the very bottom of our properties, we have layer spacing as well. And if there's multiple layers, we can space them out along the Z. And so you could see on, something like this, these layers of these various shapes, when separated, they're abstract, but this is then something that somebody can place and walk through depending on the scale. There's this urban one here. So same thing, before you do any layer spacing, which is at the very bottom of properties, you might have to scroll down in that panel. But then if I add along the Z, though this one doesn't look like it has, which would be weird to not have multiple layers, but that's okay because we have our own layer to play with. That sounded very snotty, but it's true. Delete these. So there's all these different things that I definitely recommend playing with just to practice. And I must have had too much coffee earlier. I was continuously double clicking on everything, which is why I kept getting that warning about you are already loading this model. But if you single click it will load just fine and peacefully and not give you that warning. But there's lots and lots of things here that you can play with and practice and get used to Aero and hopefully export and create some cool different augmented reality just kind of tests. If you want a plant on your desk but you've got cats, here's your chance. These were the trees that I was using in that creepy scene that I created, plus that ornate text, but there's some fun things in here. But these are just the ones, oh yeah, and then the origami ones. Look at this bear. We can make him, make him scratch himself up against this tree. Got all kinds of options in here. The opportunities are limitless with Adobe, and then you just have to animate that. And then space up exploration, which I did use one of those. And then here we have some planets. So we're going full circle, pun intended, from our original planetary. If we add some more of these, then we're going full circle from our original space 2.5D files, but we could see what these look like too. So lots and lots of things to play with here. Oh, and transportation toys at the very bottom. I want to import that Starry Night PSD. So I am going to actually just hide these for now. And click on that little plus sign up here by Starter Assets. And I just have this in downloads. You would have this in a better organized folder. It's just a demo after all. And then so just like those starter assets that are multi-layered, it's flat at first, but then if we go down to the layer spacing properties, we can space it out along the Z and add that dimension to it. And if you've scanned the QR code for the file at all and have placed it, I was clicking 1, 2, 3, but I was actually trying to go between my camera tools, but I was like typing in down here secretly, apparently. If you've scanned the QR code or if you have played with this previously, you can see that this is just the painting, but then when I had deleted things like the tree, I just done content aware deletion. And then using layer spacing. I'm just pointing this out again because this is probably the hardest thing to find in Aero because it's the only thing that kind of scrolls off of the page. It's the very bottom of properties, lower right corner. Underneath size is layer spacing Z. And of course, other layer spacing can be fun to play with too, but Z is going to give you your depth and goes back to those first few weeks of class when we were talking about creating depth within a scene. Except for this depth, we can export and place within reality and have people interact with it. What's also really cool about this is that, like I mentioned before, we can import from multiple sources. So seeing as how we have a little bit of kind of an outer space thing going here, I had gone to the space exploration pack and was kind of playing around with adding other elements like this satellite. So this is obviously too big. I think in the example I have online, there is a little astronaut on there that, spoiler alert, next week I'm going to animate him so he like spins wildly. That seems like that would be a suitable a suitable astronaut animation. But if we want to add this little element here, we can import elements from multiple sources, whether they're 3D or 2.5D, and kind of combine them into this scene. And if I want to bring in one of these abstract shapes too, just for fun, sure, yeah, big gold sphere. Kind of matches my color palette here. Maybe I'll lock the attributes for scale and then bring the whole thing down. The shortcuts of 1, 2, 3, and V work the same, which is pretty great. Actually, maybe instead, well, I'm going to make this much, much smaller so it's more like a star. And then there's this little duplicate plus sign. And then let's kind of space those out. Yeah. Alright, so nothing crazy, but just a few kind of golden stars in the sky and a satellite. So we've got some 3D and some 2.5D. And if you've never worked with the content-aware deletion before in Photoshop, obviously any of these things you could always ask me offline too, but these are just separate layers in the program. There's some masking going on, but just anything that I want to have separate is just its own layer. But the fact that you can bring in a PSD is pretty great. But for something like this, I just figured out what I wanted each layer to look like content-wise. So I've got tree, city, hills, and sky. That's pretty much how it's separated in the scene. And then just in Photoshop kind of broke it down that way. So like if I wanted to get rid of this star for some reason, whether I was making it on its own layer or filling it in with something else, I would make a selection around that. That's like the worst selection I think I've made. If you make your selection around your object and then do Shift-Delete, you'll bring up content-aware deletion. And this is always a good starting point. I usually do this on the copy of a layer. This is actually the original. But content-aware deletion will get you usually a pretty good head start. You could see it kind of randomize some of the brush strokes here, but most people, even without any retouching, would have a hard time telling that there was something there before. But content-aware deletion is a pretty awesome tool. Otherwise, you of course have the clone stamp and the painting tools as well. But your assignment is to start thinking about what you want to do for your final project, whether it's in 2.5D or 3D or both, and then start gathering those assets. So I have this Starry Night file. This isn't something you need to turn in. This is just to play with. There's all of these abstract shapes that you can play with as well. I definitely want you to create a good portion of the assets that you're using in your final, and to plan it out ahead of time, of course. And really try to demonstrate some of the things that we've talked about this semester, particularly with depth. Here, we're not really worrying so much about the camera or controlling the person's view, because the view is really being determined by the person and their phone or tablet. So it's just a different way of looking at literally 3D design and immersive design, and just moving forward the different things that we might have to consider when thinking about this kind of work. So start exploring Aero if you haven't already. Start sketching out some ideas of what you want to do for your final. And next week we're going to be talking about adding animatable and behaviors to objects within Aero. And please let me know if you have any questions. But I feel like I should add one more thing here. If I wanted to share this, I have other ones that are already on there. I know, like I have a variation of this. But remember, I have preview. If I want to get a general idea, it really just hides all of the kind of palettes and everything else around it. But if I go File, Export, that's how I can save that .real file so that I can work on this again later. Otherwise, if I go File, Share, that's just going to open up the same little dialog box over here where I can create a link and generate that QR code or ping file so that others with Aero on their phones can view and place my Starry Night file in their homes or driveways or workplaces or wherever they are when viewing this project.